Tonight's Master Beekeeper study group is going to focus on queens and queen rearing and all of the special things about them and a little bit on genetics. And I'm going to hand it over to Master Beekeeper John Davis to talk about that with us tonight. So, John, it is all yours.
All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about rearing queens, a little bit about genetics. Not sure what the level of both expertise and interest is, but if I'm talking above where you are right now or below where you are right now, we can sort out questions at the end without any issue. If you have questions and are in the chat, I will tell you that for me, I don't type and do anything particularly rapidly. So I'll ask Christine to kind of track that. And if there's something going on, let me know.
No problem, John.
We will go from there. So the thing that we're going to be talking about is essentially this right here. The world does revolve around the queen. So, as beekeepers, when we get to the point that we are thinking about doing more than just buy a queen, buy a package, or buy a replacement queen and put her in the colony, we start thinking about getting into rearing some for ourselves. There's a process that we go through, and there's no single, obviously, right way or wrong way to produce queens. You can do it a lot of different ways, and a lot of them work. The thing that we need to keep into mind is to work with the bees and let them do the majority of the work. So you can raise queens pretty much any time of the year if the bees are flying. But if you do it too early, you'll have queens that are ready to mate before they have any drones to mate with. If you do it too late, you may end up in the same situation. And you'll go into the fall and into winter with what appears to be a good queen, and you'll come out of fall or come out of winter like one of the hives that when we were doing our inspection, the we had a situation where I had one that was a drone laying queen. So they superseded late in the fall last year. She did not get mated and laying nice patterns in the frames, but all drones in worker size cells. So she has since been pinched and replaced. But this is what happens when we try to push the seasons further than the bees really want to cooperate with us. So what we're talking about is, you use their instincts. So it's easy during swarming season. If there's a flow going on, you got to have drones to mate. And there's lots of ways to do it. Okay. Grafting, which is the Doolittle method. There's lots of variations on how to build cells once they're grafted. You can do settle finishers. You can do queenless versus queen right. We'll talk a little bit about those without going into all of the details. The thing that when we're talking with beekeepers that are just starting out doing this is to be patient, understand the basics, understand the biology and the timing for the method that you want to try, because timing is critical. And the other thing that is most important, and I hadn't said it yet, but lots of nurse bees. That is one of the most important things to keep in mind. So when I talk about lots of nurse bees, that's a fair number of nurse bees. So this is the type of thing that you're looking for. You want the colony that is producing your queen cells because it takes several thousand feedings to put enough royal jelly in with that queen that she gets fed. You don't have to have extra royal jelly at the end when the cell is capped, but you don't want her to have any time that she can't have all she wants. As long as she's got one more bite when she's spinning her cocoon and quits eating, you're in good shape. But you don't want her to be short on royal jelly. So the other thing that we start talking about is, you're going to make your own queens. So one of the things that you've got to take into consideration is what are your goals and what criteria are you going to use to decide which queen you want to reproduce from? Which hives are you going to split? Why are you picking those? Those are personal decisions, okay? Or which hive are you going to graft from? Same situation is you've got to make a choice as to why you want to continue the genetics of your chosen hive. And the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the way bees mate is very dilutive for whatever genetics are there. So, if you choose a queen from your best hive, whatever your definition of best hive, it's better than nothing, okay, but not a hell of a lot, okay? Unless you have a very large pool to choose from and the discipline to keep records so that you know over time which line of bees is doing better than the other ones, because there's so much variability from hive to hive, you don't have very good choices to make that are statistically valid. So one of the things that when I took statistics a long time ago, my professor said, if you don't know what the population that you're trying to evaluate is like, then you need at least 30 samples to get a pool that you can get any idea of what's going on. And we see that in some of the other folks that are making selections. If you have that magic bee tree that you got a feral swarm from, there's no guarantee that that's going to be anything better than what you've got in your yard already. One hive and no data does not give you a whole lot of choice. But if that's all you've got to decide what is your best because that's what you're going to get more of. So my preference is to make decisions based on data. And this is where you've got to keep records. Okay. So the way people are selecting at this point, there's a lot of things that you can look at. So the type of data that folks have been collecting, try to make these decisions. One of it is a freeze kill or a pin kill assay. And this was originally used to work to determine what we call hygienic bees. So the Minnesota hygienic bee line was developed as a method of trying to reduce the amount of American foul brood because they were looking for bees that they had the characteristics that were strong housekeepers, strong cleaners. They removed damaged brood, and what they were trying to do was to get the dead and dying cleaned out, get the scale from American foul brood stuck in the bottom of the cells cleaned out. So they were looking for hygienic bees. And the definition of that was they looked at when they killed a section of brood, what percentage of that dead brood was removed in one day. And the Minnesota hygienic line, that's where they originally came from. All right. So, along with that, what we also hear are things like the Purdue ankle biters or mite biters. And what they were determining there was in looking at the colonies that they had, they saw a few colonies that when they were looking at the mites that the bees seemed to be working on, they found that on the bottom board, they found some mites that looked like the bees had been chewing on their legs and feet. So they said, okay, if this is helping to get the bees to, or helping the bees to get the bees off of the, get the mites off of the bees, I'll get it out in a minute. Then the more mites they found with chewed feet on them were the ones that they selected hives to continue to breed from. So originally they were seeing hives that didn't have any chewed feet, and they found some that had maybe 10 to 15%. So they started breeding from those hives, and through selection, they increased that so that then they were seeing around now that the mites that are being dropped are about 45 to 50% that have chewed feet. Now, the data doesn't really show that that makes a big difference in the number of mites in the hive, but it's one additional characteristic that we've been selecting for. All right. So a couple other selection made also based on data. So what we call the Harbo assay for VSH for Varroa specific hygiene, and that's different than the general hygiene trait from the freeze kill method. Okay. And to do that, what you're determining in that case is you're looking at the percentage of non-reproductive female mites in a colony. And it's very laborious because you've got to examine a whole lot of purple-eyed or later pupa to see whether the mother mite in that cell is reproducing or not. And normal mite populations, 20 to 25% of those mother mites are not reproducing. So you've got to count a lot of cells to find a statistically valid number. So sometimes you may have to open 300, 400 cells to find the 30 to 40 mites to give you a population to say what percentage of those mites are actually reproduction or reproducing and which ones are not. So it's not an easy test to do, but it's the only true method for determining what we talk about when we're talking about Varroa specific hygiene. And the people that have been doing that, John Harbo was working down at the Bee Lab in Baton Rouge, and the USDA has been working on that for about 25 years. John since retired. They're still doing that work, and that's where the pole line of VSHBs was developed as a result of that research. The other thing that we've heard a lot about recently is being advertised a bunch is UBO, unhealthy brood odor. Sorry. So this is a relatively new test. It's been out about 2 years, and folks are using that to look at hygienic behavior in bees. It's not freeze kill. So if you're doing this kind of a test, you don't have to worry about having the insulated containers for liquid nitrogen or, pouring liquid nitrogen on a portion of a frame of brood to freeze it and then let it thaw back out and put it in the hive for 24 hours. It's a more user-friendly test in that the pheromones that are in that, you spray it on a section of the hive, put it back in, and the determination time is a couple of hours rather than 24 hours. So you get results a whole lot quicker. It is a good test for general hygiene. It does not have a real good correlation to VSH. So if you're using UBO, you just have to be aware that you're testing for the same type of hygiene that right now you would be doing if you do the pin kill method or the freeze kill method. There's not a good correlation to VSH at this point. A couple other methods that are on data is, if you record your mite counts when you're doing your washes over time and you're finding, bees that are consistently low with low or minimal treatment, those are the types of things that you can record. But you have to remember that there's a lot of things that affect those mite counts because you can have a colony that has low reproductive mites in it because the bees are intervening, but you also have, in that case, a lot of times a stronger colony. And if they're out robbing from the weak, they're bringing mites back in, then you can get spikes that are not related to the actual reproductive rate of the colony. So if you don't take all of those types of things into consideration and you're only doing one count, then you may not get the hives that you would like to choose from because the results are skewed. So this is one of the things that the gentleman from University of Guelph was talking about. And it's simple things, but you have to look at it based on where your location is. Okay, so he was doing mite wash counts, and for him, it works pretty well as a way to determine characteristics in a colony. Where he is located up in Canada, his situation is different than ours is, or different down in Georgia. So in Canada, further considerably north than where we are, their spring is later. When things start blooming, they have a pretty much continuous nectar flow, fairly concentrated, shorter period of time than normally don't have a dearth. They go directly into fall and winter. So he can do a mite count and 6 weeks later come back and do a mite count and not be in a situation where he has the robbing issues and the things that we have during a dearth. So for us to get the same type of realistic data, you have to time the mite wash counts if that's what you're going to use, so that you take into consideration, are my bees robbing? Do I do my count early in the spring and then before the honey flow is over, so that you don't have those other extraneous influxes coming in if mite counts are the things that you're using to help make your selection. So this is where all beekeeping is local. And you have to take those things into consideration, because you can get data that is not what you think it is because you have some outside influences sometimes affecting it. Randy Oliver's work is similar to that. If you look at the scientific beekeeping website and you look at the work that he's been doing about selecting for mite resistance in a commercial population, you'll see a couple of things if you read through those articles that I'm talking about. He didn't start with 5 hives and tried to pick the best one. He did mite washes over some of his yards with like 1,000 hives to start with. And over time, he picked the best 30 to make his first selections, and has continued to work with those, continuing to refine over time to select breeding lines that seem to work well for him. But his work is a good example of the amount of statistical data that you need to make really data-based decisions, rather than a gut feel of, oh, I got the magic bee tree down the road. And there's one other thing that we haven't heard a lot more about. I'm still waiting on Zach Lamas was doing a program with some of the Virginia beekeepers last summer or summer before, where he was collecting drones from the hives to look at whether or not the mite counts on drones would be a possibility, because what his data had showed previously was that the mite counts that we get in a hive, that mites not only prefer to breed in drone brood, but they also have a tendency to feed on drones. And this is another one of those things that really will throw our data off. If you're doing a mite wash and you get 0 and you don't have any drones in that particular sample, that may not be as representative as if you had one drone that had 3 mites on it in the same 300 bees. So you end up with a 1% versus a 0%. If you might have 5 drones off the brood frame that you took that sample from, and they had a couple of mites on each one, then you're still not getting an accurate representation of what's really going on in that hive, because the number of drones that you get in your sample can skew your data as well. And a lot of people don't always think about it in those kind of details. So when you're starting to talk about queen rearing, whether you're thinking about doing it or whether you've been doing it for a while, it's often good to reevaluate your assumptions to say, what am I choosing for? Why am I choosing it? Am I making database decisions or am I just going on gut feel? So generally, selection methods based on data is what I would prefer and recommend that we think about. But if you're going to raise a bunch of queens, and especially if you're providing those to customers, I would say that it's good to make good data driven choices so that they get the best bees that you can provide for them. So the thing that we're talking about is, yeah, that feral bee tree could be the magic queen, and you catch her, and life is good, and we found a solution to mites. Then again, because of the way that bees mate, there's a lot of bees that have some of those genetics that are out there. The question is, how do you find them, which is what we're talking about data, and then how do we work on that so that it's a reasonable amount of time to continue the process? So this is where, I tell people a lot of times that when I'm talking about queen rearing, you want to start with the best choice for breeder that you possibly can, because that's going to influence everything else that you're doing after that. And I use the example that you can breed an Angus or a Hereford beef steer from a Texas Longhorn. The genes are there, but you're going to have a hell of a lot of generations before you get that Longhorn to look like the beef cow that you really want. So with us in beekeeping, because of the way that queens mate with multiple drones and because of the way the genes are disseminated, it's a whole lot harder. So in this case, if you buy the bull, you've got a hell of a lot better start than starting with the longhorn out of the feral bee tree. And one of the reasons that it is that way is the effect, which is a good thing for honeybees, the effect of polyandry, because the queens mate with so many drones. So if this is kind of visual representation of what you get. So in a colony itself, so if the queen mated with 20 drones, and there's not 20 here, but for practical purposes, you've got a queen that has got a selection of genes in her. And she's mating with multiple drones, all of which have a different selections and combinations of genetics. So when this queen is producing offspring, so the egg side that she's producing, she could have four easily different eggs produced. Okay. So the eggs that she produces are not necessarily going to be 100% identical to her. And the drones that she is producing, because I'm sorry, she has mated with these drones. Okay. So her offspring could be her choice of four different egg possibilities and a drone that she mated with, or another drone that she mated with, or another drone that she mated with. And this is why we see some colonies pick up more propolis. Some colonies produce a lot more pollen. Some colonies produce more honey, depending on the characteristics of these whole cadre of drones. If you get 8 of the 10 drones that are carrying some genetics from an old line of Africanized bees, then all of these offspring in that colony are going to be a little bit pissier. Okay. If you only have one, you might have a colony that you can go in barehanded and find, but you've got 2 or 3 bees that want to follow you back to the shed because that one drone, when that one's semen gets used, you get a couple of bees that may be pissy when they're guard bees. So the characteristic of the colony is the whole characteristic of all of the drones. So if some of these drones carry genes that they're more likely to be pollen gatherers, then you end up with a hive that may have a whole box of pollen at the bottom in the fall because those foragers were concentrating on that. If you have one that had a lot of genetics for honey, that's the one that may produce you a booming honey crop, but may not have any propolis, and it's an easy hive to work. So it's not a drone that the queen mated with. It's the sum characteristics of all of the genetics of these drones that give you the characteristic that we recognize as a colony characteristic. So this makes for interesting problems because this one queen, if you decide that you want to split that hive to produce a couple more, well, you may get this egg, okay, fertilized with this drone in the queen cell that you choose to take with the split. Or you may get this egg with this drone. So you get more characteristic from the queen, but there's not always the same drone that produced the sperm that fertilized the egg that you choose to be your new queen. So it makes it very, very hard to make good choices without a lot of detail about these characteristics and how they followed through over time. All right, so we talk about bee math, and this, when you get into raising queens, this gets to be really important, depending on how you're doing it. All right, so for new beekeepers, if you all are teaching beekeepers with more experienced folks, if you're working with new beekeepers, there's a lot of math, but basic bee math is this part with workers and queens right here. So for workers, instead of trying to memorize the charts and memorize drones, just take drones out of the picture. They don't make any difference in what we're teaching, especially new beekeepers. But when it comes time to be working with queen rearing, it's also important to know queens and workers, just like it is a new beekeeper that's trying to do troubleshooting because their hive is swarmed and they think they got to go buy a queen. So a simple way to explain it is that B math for workers is multiplication. You multiply by two. All eggs hatch in 3 days. 3 times 2 is 6. 6 days is a larva. 6 times 2 is 12. 12 days as capped brood. So worker B math is multiplication. 3, 6, 12. B math for queens is addition. Because they get fed a better diet, they mature faster. So it's 5 days as a larva instead of 6. Same thing though, 3 days is an egg. All eggs hatch in 3 days. So 3 days is an egg, add 3 plus 5 is 8. 8 days as a capped queen cell. And that queen will emerge 16 days after the egg was laid. So this becomes important when you're planning, if you're grafting and you need to know when you need to move things around. If you are doing splits and you need to know when to go back in to remove those extra queen cells, you got to remember these parts. Okay. If you are grafting and you're doing queenless cell builders and you're using supplemental brood, you need to be paying attention to when is that brood frame going to emerge so that you've got the right age worker bees to have a lot of nurse bees to be able to feed those queens. So bee math in its simplest form, worker multiply by 2, queens add. All right. So again, we're talking about working with the bee's instincts. So this is where you have to depend on what your goals and what your comfort level are, because there's a lot of ways to make queens. All right. You can do splits, put cells in nukes. You can do artificial swarming. You can use snell growth, demarray, OTS, okay, on the spot, OTS. Hopkins method, Miller method, grafting, which is the Doolittle method, and it's not as complicated as it seems. Right? So, first again, determine what your goals are. How many queens do you need to make? Are you just want to increase a couple of hives for yourself, or are you deciding you want to sell queens? You need to know what your goals are to determine and use a method that you're comfortable with. Okay. Again, multiply from what you consider to have the best traits that you want. Try to use data to make those decisions. Okay. Some things you may be looking at are gentleness, honey production, small winter cluster that eats less, low mite counts. There's lots of things you need to decide what it is that you're trying to propagate, whether it's for yourself or for its customers. Either way, what is it that you're looking for and how do you make those decisions? All right. One thing to remember, especially for new beekeepers, okay, if you're making a split and your goal is to help to minimize swarming, move the old queen to the new hive so that that simulates the swarming impulse being satisfied. And no matter what you do, the principle is, did I say it before? Yes, lots of nurse bees. That's lots of nurse bees. All right. So, what we're looking for this time of year are signs of swarm preparations. So, you'll see progression through the spring. And where we are now, we've got some cell cups at this point, queen cups. Few of us are starting to see some queen cells. At that point, we're playing catch up. So this is where I recommend that you need to be looking in February. Tilt your boxes up, look and see what's going on. You know the progress through the spring. Okay. Queen is producing replacement foragers. Then she'll make a little bit of drone brood and then a little more drone brood. And then you'll have some walking and flying drones and you'll start see queen cups increasing. So when you're seeing these preparations, that's a very good time to start thinking about rearing queens because the bees are in the process and you can help yourself a bunch. Now, it can be as simple as you're waiting for them to get ready to swarm and you're letting the bees do 100% of the work. They've made you a nice bunch of queen cells on the bottom of a frame that you can cut off and raise a queen with each one of those cells. Okay. You see pictures of lots of them this way. All right. One of the things that's hard about this, where all of these things are fastened on, you start cutting and tearing, you have a tendency to damage a lot. These are fastened together. They're a little hard to separate. So the easy way sometimes is not quite as easy as you think it is, but you're letting the bees do what they naturally want to do. All right. So in this situation, it's a little bit different. So you can cut this one out. You can cut this one out. So you can let them make some emergency cells, or you can get swarm cells in different places. All right. And contrary to a lot of popular opinion, they are on vertical surfaces. Okay. And vertical to a bee is not the same as vertical on the bottom of the frame like those other pretty pictures were. So the top of the frame is just as vertical as the bottom, and they can make swarm cells pretty much any place they have a vertical opportunity. Okay. And this is kind of an example of that. So, what do you think this is? Is this a swarm cell, supersedure cell, emergency cell? What would you say that is? Everybody's got their muted thing on, so I will answer this. Okay. Look down here, there's another queen cell. Okay. This is a solid frame of brood. Okay. And this is what you see in a hive that is just about ready. or maybe left yesterday with the swarm. So even though this looks kind of like it would be an emergency cell, because we tell everybody super procedure and emergency is always on the face of the comb, that's just as much a swarm cell as that one. Swarm cells are not so much just by position, they're more by both position and number. If you've got two or three, it's more likely to be supersedure or emergency. Emergency, especially if it is like these, where these cells were started horizontally and they floated that up and turned it down. So that's characteristic of an emergency cell, that the larva was originally laid in a horizontal position. And that gives you a clue to the next question is, what is the difference between a queen cell, a drone cell, and a worker cell? The answer is right here and right here. Okay. Workers and drones are all horizontal. If it's vertical, it's a queen. And that's what triggers the queen or triggers the workers to feed that larva to become a queen. It's why when we do a graft, we can take a larva from a horizontal cell, put it into a vertical position, and they will feed it to be a queen. The Hopkins method is another way of doing that as well. I'm not going to go into the detail part, but the difference is not size or peanut shape. Is it vertical or is it horizontal? So vertical, it's going to be a queen. Horizontal, it's going to be a worker or a drone. All right. So what I just talked about is there's a bunch of different ways to do it. So real quick, the Miller method is one. We said that we want queen cells to be on in a vertical position. So the trick in a Miller method of producing queens is give the bees a lot of vertical edges to produce queen cells on, and then trigger them to use their biology to make queens for you. I'm not going to go into more of the detail than that. Demarray is another method to get them to produce queen cells. A lot of people use this Demarray method to produce honey. It can also be used to produce queen cells for splits, depending on what your goals are. It requires the use of a queen excluder. So it's one piece of equipment that you need to have. So we can raise new queens and prevent swarming. Okay. The key is that you're splitting the hive. You take all of the brood, all of the open brood, and put it up in the top of the hive above a queen excluder, and put the queen all the way down in the bottom. And because of that, they're going to make emergency queen cells in that top box. So if you want honey, you better take all those cells out. If you want to produce more hives, you can use those cells to do splits with other bees. Snellgrove is very similar to that. It requires a Snellgrove board or a double screen board, but the principle is the same. You're using the biology of the bees to separate the queen and have her in an area where she's got lots of room to lay, and put the open brood and the resources to be able to make a queen above the Snellgrove or double screen board, and they will make emergency queens for you that you can harvest and use in whatever method that you want. So you can use double screen board, Snellgrove board, both of them work the same way. All right. So what you're doing is just what I said. You separate the combs, put them, in this case, we'll talk about box A and box B. So put all the brood, okay, into box A. The other box, box B, you put all the broodless combs with the bees, one comb with a little bit of unsealed brood and the queen. They're going down in the bottom of the hive. Okay. So what you see is a situation that you end up like this. So you start out with a hive, it's got a super on it, box for brood and excluder. You can give them more room, excluders up, When you get ready to do the Demeray, or I'm sorry, the Snell Grove, you take the queen, make sure she's in the bottom, your box for honey storage. You put the Snell Grove board in, and all of that open brood is up here. So they're going to make queen cells up here while the queen is building a new brood nest and continuing to build population down here. What we call on the spot queen rearing. So these are Mel Distel Cohen's slides. His website is mdasplitter.com. Remember what I said about beekeeping is local. Okay. He's up in Michigan. He doesn't have small hive beetle to amount to anything. He's also far enough north that he has good steady flows. So when you look at his YouTube videos, if you go to his website, you got to keep in mind that what he's doing up there does not apply to what we're doing down here. The timing of his splits, if we were doing what he's talking about doing down here, the small hive beetle would eat us alive. And even with that, when you get into his website and you listen to some of his presentations, he's making bees. In his presentations, you'll hear him say in one of them, he expects to have a 75% loss, but he's doing enough splits in a season that he makes up everything he needs with the 25% that survive. But in this case, what we're doing is creating a way for the bees to convert this horizontal cell into a vertical cell. See how these are open right here? So the OTS method is you just take your hive tool, find a place where you've got the right age larva, and you stick your hive tool in there and push those down to create now this cell has no bottom on it. So this is now a vertical cell because you've taken the bottom third of it off. So it's closed at the top. It's now vertical instead of horizontal. So you do this, push the comb down out of the way, and the bees will work on some of these larvae and continue to feed them to produce queen cells. So it's a quick and easy way of doing it. You can see the indentation where he made his notch on the comb down here. Okay. And this is a little bit closer up. Pick the right age larva, go in here, notch the comb, push it down, change what was an open horizontal to now vertical, open on the bottom. And the result is you want the bees to build a couple of queen cells for you. And last but not least, the Doolittle or grafting. And again, there's lots of tools, lots of ways of doing these things. Okay. You can make it very simple or you can make it real complicated. You'll hear things talking about like swarm boxes and cell starters, cloak board using queenless starter and finishers, or a queenless starter and a queen right finisher. There's lots of combinations and ways of doing these things. It doesn't have to be that complicated. Okay. The key is give them larvae in a vertical position, lots of nurse bees so they get fed everything that they can possibly want. And what you're trying to do, you want lots of nurse bees feeding those cells. Okay. And what you want to see is a day or two after you graft is a cell that's got lots of royal jelly in it. They're extending the queen cell down. The larva is up here getting fed, and life should be good. If you want some references, okay, the two things that if you're doing it whether commercially or small time doesn't make a lot of difference. The principles are the key thing, and then you pick a way that works for you. For my money, this is an old book, Contemporary Queen Rearing, Harry Laidlaw. This book, I think, was 1979 published. And when you look at it, you go, oh, that's not worth a damn. Look at these pictures. They have not updated any of the pictures. It's old looking stuff. But all of the principles and all of the things that he's talking about apply today. The equipment looks a little bit different, but the principles and what he's doing, he was one of the best in what what he wrote down. He has another book that he wrote with Robert Page that was done in 1997. Difference is this book's about $60 and this book's $20 or less. And this one has got everything that you need to know in it. This one has got a little bit of additional genetic theory at the end of it that really doesn't amount to much unless you're really, really serious in doing stuff. So this one is the one that when I teach queen rearing, this is the one that I include in my class. The other resource, if you are doing a small amount of queens and still learning the principle, there's an article called Beginner to Beginner Queen Rearing. The guy that wrote it is David LaFarney. I think it was published in a magazine called Over the Garden Gate. But if you find that, that is a good explanation of small scale queen rearing that doesn't take nearly as many resources depending on what you're intending to do. And with that, I will open it up and see if I can confuse the heck out of everybody.
Does anyone have any questions for John?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
What have you found to be the best way to kind of suss out a good queen producer? Obviously one close to your apiary, I would assume. But what are kind of some check boxes that we can look at, especially if we want to introduce genetic diversity in our apiary?
The good thing about getting something local is going to being able to go and visit and see what he's doing, ask questions about, how is he selecting his breeder queens, if that's what you're doing. And, I talked a little bit about, if he can't show you data or does not have a reason why his choices are good, then you may or may not be getting something that you want. The other thing is, talk to other people that have bought queens from that person and see how they do. In my case, I don't do the Harbo testing because it's like I said, it's very labor intensive. I get my queens. I've been buying queens from John Harbo, so he's one of the two queen suppliers that I've been using for breeder queens. So he's doing the instrumental insemination. VP Queens is the other one. They're the ones that worked with the USDA to develop the pole line queens, and they do the instrumental insemination. Personally, I'm not going to invest 3 grand into the equipment. I'm 74. I don't have time to mess with it, is what it boils down to. But I'm going to buy that prize bull, and I produce the first generation queens from those inseminated breeder queens. So those are the types of things that you want to talk to your queen supplier about. And they should be able to give you some information about, why are they choosing? What are they doing? Are they doing their own selection? If so, how are they doing it? Have they kept some records? Have they got some data that says this is why I'm making my choices in producing queens the way that I am?
And another question I thought of while you were speaking, and I know some have come through the chat, so I will mute myself. But for me, for example, I only have a few hives. And I found occasionally after a treatment or just, happenstance that, one can find themselves queenless, sometimes a bit surprising. So would you recommend, people who are doing this long term to set up some queen castles or kind of have, I guess, queen bees on hand? I'm using air quotes in such a way to kind of save yourself, save your apiary type of thing.
The answer in short is yes. The It doesn't take a lot of special equipment. Part of being sustainable is the thought process that you're referring to, and it's a very good thought process. If you've got 3 colonies, having a queen in a fallback position is a good thing. So you can take a nuke and produce a queen, have her have a colony in the nuke, manage the nuke. You don't have to carry that nuke through the fall, but if you lose one in September from a treatment, she's your fallback position. If you don't want to
Yeah. Okay.
overwinter it, if you don't want to overwinter it, you can pinch her and join that the bee population to another colony and have a stronger colony going into the winter. So this is I've been doing this since the mid 1960s. When I started, you bought a package of bees, they got in the mail, you put them in a hive, and they started from scratch. At this point, we try to recommend that people start with two hives so that they can compare and contrast, and they've got some resource fallback. Like you said, if you lose a queen, you can hopefully have eggs, or you can have another hive to combine it with so that you don't lose all the investment. Personally, if you've got two or three hives, having a nuke as that fallback position is a good thing. And if you want to carry a nuke through the winter, you can do that and get inspected and have a nuke to sell in the spring and recoup a little bit of your investment. So there's no downside to it. Yes, from sustainable beekeeping, I think, those things are a great idea. You don't have to invest in queen castles and a lot of other things. That's why I said, think what your goals are and then determine what do you need to do to get to that goal. And if it's just having a fallback position, a five frame nuke, you can overwinter a single medium five frame nuke with some supplemental food on top. I do it all the time. So you don't have to have necessarily 5/5/5 to be able to get a nuke through the winter, or you can combine it and have stronger colonies going in if you don't want to carry one over.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
What else we got, Christine?
So I put a question in the chat for you. Um, and really it's an either or both, but what are the biggest challenges in maintaining a sustainable queen rearing operation, and what's the best way they can be addressed?
Queen rearing is easy. The bees do the work. It's not nearly as complicated as it seems to be sometimes on YouTube. The hard part about rearing queens is the resources to be able to do it. Because for every queen cell you produce, you've got to have a colony or a nuke or a mini mating nuke to get that queen mated. So it takes a lot of bees to stock those things and maintain those things to be able to produce a fair number of queens. One or two is not too bad because you can do it in a five frame nuke and there you are. But if you're trying to produce 20 or 30, you have to take those things into consideration. If you're going to do, you've got 20 colonies and you want to make queens to replace all the queens in your colonies, then that's not as big a deal because you can graft 20, graft 25, end up with 20, and pinch the queens and put the cells in and let them fly from their new home colony to mate. If you're trying to do it in mating nukes, then that means you need 20 more colonies of some size, whether it's a three frame mating nuke, a regular five frame nuke, a mini mating nuke. That's where the hard part and the resources come.
And that actually leads directly into my next question, John, is about how queen banking can be used for short-term storage of mated queens, and what are the risks in that?
Queen banking for short term storage, personally, I don't like it. And I do it, but only when it's really, really, really necessary. In my case, I don't produce as many queens as a lot of queen producers do. I'm not pulling them on a timetable that says 8 days after this queen emerged, she should have been mated, so I'm going to pull her and put another queen cell in. I hold my queens in the mating nukes until I know that they are laying and I see capped broods so that I know they're producing workers and they're not drone laying queens. What I try to do for my customers, because I'm not shipping queens cross country, I they come pick them up. I pull them out of the colony that they are laying eggs in, and they go into their new colony that afternoon. So they don't get much more fresh and strong pheromones. The longer you bank them, that's where they start losing those pheromones because they're not able to lay freely. So you can bank them. I have the best luck with a queenless bank. So that means you have to take another colony and take the queen out of it and have the queens caged so that they're protected from each other and the nurse bees can feed them. But the longer they stay in there, the harder it is to get them accepted. So fresher is better. It's kind of like peaches.
Yeah, I usually try to limit it to under a week,
Yep.
no more than 7 days. I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight to Master Beekeeper Study Group. And I want to thank John so much for his presentation on queens and queen rearing. I hope to see everybody back here next month. Our next topic will be emailed out to everyone that signed up for the Master Beekeeper Study Group. And have a great night. Thank you.